The morning of December 19th, 1944, Stoumont Station, Belgium. Lieutenant Charles Powers stood in the open hatch of his Sherman tank, scanning the fog-shrouded road ahead through the Ardennes forest. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and his breath formed clouds in the bitter air. Behind him, two more Shermans from the 740th Tank Battalion waited in the narrow valley where the Amblève River curved against steep wooded slopes. Powers knew what was coming down that road: Kampfgruppe Peiper. The spearhead of the First SS Panzer Division, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jochen Peiper, had been smashing through American lines for 3 days, leaving a trail of burning vehicles and massacred prisoners. Intelligence reports said Peiper had Panthers, Mark IVs, and the most feared tank in the German arsenal, Tigers and King Tigers, with their legendary 88mm guns that could destroy a Sherman from over 2,000 yards away. The Sherman's 75mm gun could barely scratch a Tiger's frontal armor at any range. Every American tanker knew the statistics. A Tiger could kill you from distances where you couldn't even effectively shoot back. The mathematics of that inequality had terrorized tank crews since Tunisia, yet Powers and his crew weren't retreating. They were preparing to do something that defied every tactical manual. Let the Panthers get close, dangerously close, 50 yards, maybe less. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 740th Tank Battalion had entered combat exactly 24 hours earlier, and they'd learned something crucial in their first engagement, something that would turn the German advantage into a fatal weakness. 3 days before, the entire American line in the Ardennes had been caught completely off guard. At 05:30, on December 16, 1944, German artillery had opened fire across an 80-mile front. Within hours, 3 German armies totaling over 200,000 men and more than 1,000 tanks began pushing through the thinly held American positions in Belgium's Ardennes forest. Adolf Hitler had personally conceived the offensive, overruling his generals who saw only futility in the plan. The goal was audacious to the point of delusion: split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate peace, freeing German forces to concentrate against the Soviet Union. The plan depended entirely on speed. German armor had to reach the Meuse River within 48 hours before American reinforcements could respond. Kampfgruppe Peiper represented the tip of the German spear. Peiper, 39 years old, was an SS veteran of the Eastern Front with a reputation for brutality. His battle group consisted of approximately 5,000, then organized into a powerful mechanized column: Panther tanks, Mark IV tanks, Tigers from the 501st Heavy SS Tank Battalion, half-tracks full of Panzer grenadiers, and supporting artillery. On paper, it was an overwhelming force. The terrain seemed to favor the attackers. The Ardennes forest, with its narrow roads winding through dense woods and steep valleys, had been considered unsuitable for major armored operations. That's why the American High Command had placed inexperienced and depleted divisions there to rest and refit. The Germans were betting that same terrain would channel their advance and prevent American forces from maneuvering to stop them. For the first 2 days, the bet paid off. Kampfgruppe Peiper crashed through Honsfeld, Bullingen, Ligneuville, and Stavelot, advancing 30 miles in 48 hours. They captured American fuel depots. They overran artillery positions. At Malmedy, Peiper's troops machine-gunned 84 American prisoners in a Spizot, snowy field, a war crime that would ensure no quarter would be asked or given for the rest of the battle. By December 18th, Peiper's column had reached L'Église, just 12 miles from First Army headquarters in Spa. General Courtney Hodges, commanding First Army, could hear the sound of German guns. His staff began preparing to evacuate. If Kampfgruppe Peiper broke through to the Meuse River, the entire Allied position in Belgium might collapse. But Peiper had problems he didn't yet fully understand. The terrain that channeled the American defenders also constrained his own movement. The roads through the Amblève Valley were narrow, bordered by cliffs on one side and the river on the other. Only 1 or 2 vehicles could advance abreast. If something blocked the road, the entire column stalled. More critically, Peiper was outrunning his supply line. German fuel shortages meant his tanks carried barely enough fuel to reach their objectives, with no reserve for maneuvering or delays. Every hour spent fighting instead of advancing consumed irreplaceable fuel. The Panthers and King Tigers, magnificent in their armor and firepower, guzzled gasoline at rates the German logistics system couldn't sustain. American reinforcements were racing to seal the breakthrough. The 30th Infantry Division, a veteran formation from the Normandy campaign, was being rushed north from rest areas. The 82nd Airborne Division, still recovering from Operation Market Garden in Holland, loaded onto trucks and headed for the battle. Artillery battalions displaced forward, preparing to lay fire across every road Peiper might use. And from an ordnance depot in Stoumont, Belgium, a collection of tankers without tanks received urgent orders. Get anything running and get it to Stoumont immediately. The German advance must be stopped at Stoumont, or the road to the Meuse would lie open. Private Harry Miller, a 19-year-old loader in the 740th Tank Battalion, had spent December 18th working through the night in the abandoned depot. The ordnance personnel had fled, leaving tools and partially repaired vehicles scattered across the facility. Miller and his fellow tankers cannibalized damaged tanks, swapping parts, jerry-rigging repairs, doing whatever it took to assemble working vehicles. By dawn on the 19th, they had 3 Shermans and 1 M36 tank destroyer operational. Not a proper tank battalion, not even a full company. Just 4 armoured vehicles, crewed by exhausted men who'd been working for 18 straight hours. But it was all First Army had available to throw into Peiper's path. Lieutenant Colonel George Rubel, commanding the 740th, organised his improvised force and attached them to elements of the 30th Infantry Division's 119th Infantry Regiment. The infantry would provide flank security. The tanks would block the road. Together, they might buy enough time for heavier reinforcements to arrive. The 740th Tank Battalion had an unusual history that would prove crucial in the coming battle. Activated at Fort Knox, Kentucky in March 1943, the battalion had originally trained as a Canal Defense Light Unit, equipped with Shermans mounting powerful searchlights for night operations. The CDL program was eventually deemed impractical, and the 740th converted to standard medium tanks. But their training had been different from typical tank battalions. They'd spent months at the Desert Training Center in Baus, Arizona, learning to operate in harsh conditions with minimal support. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Rubel, emphasized aggressive action and quick decision-making. The men called themselves the Daredevil Tankers, a nickname they'd earned through their willingness to take calculated risks. Now they were about to take the biggest calculated risk of their lives. The tactical situation at Stoumont Station represented everything American armor had learned to fear. The Germans had superior tanks with better guns and thicker armor. The terrain prevented American forces from using their mobility advantage. The narrow valley eliminated any possibility of flanking maneuvers. This was exactly the kind of head-to-head slugfest where German technical superiority should have proved decisive. American tank doctrine had evolved considerably since the disasters of Tunisia in 1943, where poorly trained crews in obsolete tanks had been slaughtered by German Panzers. By late 1944, American tankers understood they couldn't win gun duels with Panthers and Tigers at long range. The Sherman's 75mm gun, firing armor-piercing ammunition, could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor only at ranges under 300 yards, and that required perfect shot placement. The Panthers' sloped frontal armor was even more challenging. At ranges beyond 500 yards, the Sherman's 75mm shells simply bounced off. Meanwhile, the German 88mm gun on Tigers and the 75mm long barrel gun on Panthers could penetrate Sherman armor from well over a mile away. This disparity had created a psychological burden on American tank crews. They knew that in any conventional engagement, the Germans would fire first, from longer range, with better chance of a kill. Sherman crews learned to expect that first German shot to come from distances where they couldn't effectively return fire. The sound of an 88mm round hitting a Sherman was distinctive, a sharp crack followed by the screech of metal tearing through metal. American armor officers had developed several tactical responses to this hardware disadvantage. The most common was to avoid tank versus tank combat entirely. Tank destroyer battalions, equipped with vehicles mounting more powerful guns, were supposed to handle enemy armor. Sherman battalions focused on infantry support, destroying fortifications and strongpoints rather than hunting panzers. When tank-on-tank combat was unavoidable, American doctrine emphasized teamwork and maneuver. 5 tank platoons would split into 2 elements, one to draw German fire, while the other flanked to attack from the side or rear, where German armor was thinnest. The tactic required coordination, communication, and courage, because the element drawing fire knew it was deliberately exposing itself to German guns. Artillery support proved even more effective than direct tank combat. Forward observers learned to call fire on German armor positions, using high-explosive shells to damage tracks, optics, and external equipment, even when the armor itself couldn't be penetrated. Immobilized German tanks became targets for follow-up attacks, or were simply bypassed and left for infantry with satchel charges and bazookas to destroy. But all these tactics assumed open terrain where American forces could maneuver. At Stoumont, there was no room to maneuver. The road through the valley was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. Dense woods on the slopes prevented off-road movement. The Germans would advance down that single road, and American forces would have to stop them there or not at all. Lieutenant Powers understood the tactical problem as he scanned the foggy road. If he engaged the Panthers at long range, his 75mm gun would be ineffective, and the Germans would destroy his tank before he could inflict meaningful damage. If he retreated, the Germans would advance unchecked toward the Meuse River. The only option was to turn the terrain against the Germans, let them advance into the valley, let them commit to the narrow road where they couldn't deploy or maneuver, and then hit them at such close range that even the Sherman's inadequate gun could penetrate Panther armor. It required letting German tanks get within 50 to 100 yards before opening fire. At that range, a Panther could destroy a Sherman with a single shot, but at that range, a Sherman could also kill a Panther if the crew was accurate and decisive. And critically, at that range in the narrow valley, the German tanks couldn't maneuver around burning wrecks blocking the road. The tactic demanded nerves most men didn't possess. Watching a Panther approach, its gun traversing to find targets, knowing that one shot would kill you, and deliberately holding fire until the German tank closed to point-blank range, required a level of discipline that bordered on suicidal courage. But the men of the 740th had been training for exactly this kind of situation. Their months in the Arizona desert had emphasized quick reaction and accurate shooting. Their commanders had drilled them endlessly on target identification and fire discipline. And now, on the morning of December 19th, they would discover whether that training could overcome the hardware disadvantage that had terrorized American tankers for 2 years. At approximately 0800 hours, the sound of diesel engines echoed through the fog. The Germans were coming. Powers ducked into his turret and alerted his crew. Corporal Jack Ashby, the gunner, peered through his sights, waiting for targets to emerge from the murk. Technician 5th grade Howard Henry, the loader, checked that an armor-piercing round was chambered. The driver and assistant driver sat tensely at their stations, ready to move on command. The fog thinned slightly, and Powers saw them. 3 Panthers in column, moving cautiously down the road. The lead tank had brush camouflage tied to its hull, and its long 75mm gun swept from side to side as the crew searched for threats. Behind it, 2 more Panthers followed at 50-yard intervals. Powers waited, 200 yards, still too far. The Panthers continued advancing, their tracks crunching over the frozen ground. 150 yards. Powers could see the commander standing in the lead Panther's hatch, scanning with binoculars. 100 yards. The German tank was close enough that Powers could make out individual details. The Zimmerit anti-mine paste coating the hull, the spare track links hung on the turret, the exhaust smoke drifting in the cold air. 75 yards. Powers gave the fire command. Ashby's 75mm gun roared. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's gun mantlet, the armor surrounding the cannon. At 75 yards, the impact deflected downward into the driver's compartment. Gasoline fuel and hydraulic fluid ignited instantly. Within seconds, the Panther was burning, orange flames billowing from the hatches. The crew scrambled out, visible for a moment before machine gun fire from American infantry cut them down. Powers felt no satisfaction, only urgency. 2 more Panthers remained, and his own Sherman was now exposed. The second Panther began, traversing its turret toward Powers's tank. But Ashby was already acquiring the new target. He fired again. The round struck low, hitting the Panther's lower frontal plate. The impact should have ricocheted harmlessly, but at this range, the shell's angle of attack found a vulnerability. The round penetrated, detonating ammunition stored in the hull. The Panther shuddered and died, its turret rocking from the internal explosion. At that critical moment, Powers's gun jammed. Henry reported the problem instantly. A shell case had failed to eject cleanly and was blocking the breach. The Sherman was helpless, with 1 Panther still advancing and Powers's crew frantically working to clear the jam. Powers waved forward the next vehicle in the American column. It wasn't a Sherman. Staff Sergeant Charlie Loopy and his crew had drawn an M36 tank destroyer at Stoumont, the only one available. The M36 mounted a 90mm gun, the most powerful anti-tank weapon in American service. Loopy's destroyer moved past Powers's disabled Sherman and engaged the 3rd Panther. At 50 yards range, the 90mm gun was devastatingly effective. The first round punched through the Panther's frontal armor as if it were paper. The German tank stopped, smoke pouring from the hatches. A second round ensured it wouldn't be recovered for repair. In 30 minutes of combat, the improvised American force had recaptured Stoumont Station and destroyed 3 Panthers. Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance had been stopped cold. The narrow valley, which should have protected the German column, had instead trapped it in a killing ground where American guns could engage at ranges that negated German armor advantages. The tactical lesson was profound. German tanks were superior in armor and firepower, but those advantages meant nothing if German crews couldn't employ them effectively. At 50 yards, a Sherman could kill a Panther. At 50 yards, the Panther's heavier armor and more powerful gun provided no protection against a well-aimed shot. And at 50 yards in a narrow valley, German tanks couldn't maneuver around destroyed vehicles blocking their path. American forces had discovered that sometimes the best response to superior enemy technology wasn't better technology. It was better tactics, better training, and the courage to close with the enemy at ranges where hardware superiority ceased to matter. But this was only the beginning. Kampfgruppe Peiper still had Tigers, more Panthers, and thousands of veteran SS troops. The battle for Stoumont was far from over, and the 740th Tank Battalion was about to face the full weight of Germany's armoured elite in combat that would test every lesson they'd learned about fighting an enemy that shouldn't be beaten. The lessons learned at Stoumont Station on December 19th spread through the American forces defending the Ardennes with remarkable speed. By nightfall, every tank commander in the 30th Infantry Division understood what the 740th had proven. German armour superiority could be negated by forcing close-range engagements in terrain that prevented German manoeuvre. But understanding a tactic and executing it under fire were vastly different challenges. The psychological burden of letting a Panther or Tiger approach to within 100 yards before engaging required a level of fire discipline that contradicted every survival instinct a tank crew possessed. Technical Sergeant Cecil Taylor, a tank commander in the 740th, described the experience decades later with characteristic understatement. "We were scared, our eyes were bugged out, but we got the job done." That simple admission captured the reality of American tank combat in the Ardennes. Fear was universal. German tanks were genuinely terrifying weapons, but American crews learned to function despite that fear, and that made all the difference. The night of December 19th brought no rest for either side. German forces regrouped, bringing forward more armour and infantry to reinforce Peiper's battered column. American forces rushed additional units into blocking positions, establishing a defensive perimeter that tightened around Kampfgruppe Peiper like a noose. The 740th received additional tanks during the night, vehicles pulled from repair depots, and rushed forward with crews who'd had minimal time to familiarize themselves with their equipment. Captain William Berry organized these reinforcements into a provisional company, mixing experienced crews from the Stoumont action with newcomers who'd never fired a shot in combat. The weather remained miserable. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Fog persisted through the morning hours. Rain turned to sleet, coating roads and armor with ice. The conditions that grounded Allied aircraft and prevented air support also reduced visibility to a few hundred yards, forcing tank combat to the close ranges where American tactics could be effective. At dawn, on December 20th, the battle resumed. German forces attacked from La Glaise towards Stoumont, attempting to break through the American blocking positions and reopen Peiper's route west. The assault began with artillery fire, German shells falling on American positions dug in around Stoumont's outskirts. Lieutenant Colonel Rubel positioned his tanks along the main road, with infantry from the 119th Regiment providing flank security in the woods. The defensive line was thin, held together more by determination than actual strength. If the Germans concentrated their armor at any single point, they could probably break through. The American strategy depended on channeling the German attack into killing grounds, where close-range ambushes could blunt each successive assault. The Germans obliged. Constrained by the narrow roads and eager to maintain momentum, Peiper committed his Panthers and Tigers to frontal attacks down the main valley roads. His tanks advanced in column, the standard formation for movement through restricted terrain, with infantry following in half-tracks. American forward observers called artillery fire on the advancing German column. High explosive shells burst along the road, killing exposed infantry and forcing the German armor to button up, sealing all hatches and restricting crew visibility to periscopes and vision blocks. This degraded German awareness of the battlefield, making it harder for commanders to spot American positions before entering engagement range. The lead German tank, a Panther, rounded a curve approximately 150 yards from Captain Berry's position. Berry's gunner was already tracking the movement, his sight trained on the curve where the road emerged from a tree line. The instant the Panther appeared, the gunner fired. The armor-piercing round struck the Panther's turret face, penetrating the armor and killing the Perlemer crew instantly. The destroyed Panther blocked the road. The second tank in the German column, another Panther, attempted to push the wreck aside but couldn't generate sufficient traction on the icy road. While the German crew struggled, American tanks engaged from multiple positions. 2 more Panthers were destroyed in as many minutes, their burning hulks creating an impassable barrier. The German infantry dismounted from their half-tracks and attempted to advance on foot, seeking to flank the American positions through the woods. But the 30th Infantry Division's riflemen were ready. Machine gun fire swept the tree line. Mortars dropped high-explosive rounds into the German infantry assembly areas. The attack stalled, then broke, German survivors retreating back toward La Glaise. Throughout December 20th, this pattern repeated. German forces launched attacks. American defenders channeled those attacks into prepared killing zones. Close-range tank fire destroyed German armor. Infantry repelled German infantry. Artillery disrupted German formations before they could fully develop their assaults. By evening, Kampfgruppe Peiper had lost additional Panthers and suffered heavy infantry casualties without achieving any breakthrough. More critically for the Germans, fuel shortages were becoming acute. Every attack consumed gasoline that couldn't be replaced. German supply columns attempting to reach Peiper were intercepted by American forces. The fuel depot at Stavelot, which Peiper had captured on December 17th, was recaptured by American forces on December 19th, denying the Germans those precious resources. Peiper's situation was deteriorating from offensive spearhead to surrounded pocket. American forces had retaken Stavelot, cutting the German supply line. The 82nd Airborne Division had moved into positions north of La Glaise. The 30th Infantry Division held Stoumont. The 3rd Armoured Division was manoeuvring to seal remaining escape routes. Kampfgruppe Peiper, which had been 12 miles from the Meuse River 3 days earlier, was now fighting for survival. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Tiger tanks of the 500 First Heavy SS Tank Battalion represented Peiper's most powerful remaining assets. These massive vehicles, weighing 57 metric tons and mounting the famous 88mm gun, had terrorized Allied armor since their debut in Tunisia in 1943. Their frontal armor, 100mm thick on the Tiger I and even heavier on the Tiger II King Tiger, was effectively impervious to standard American tank guns at normal combat ranges. But at Stoumont and L'Aglaise, normal combat ranges didn't exist. The terrain forced engagements at distances measured in dozens of yards, not hundreds, and at those ranges, even Tigers were vulnerable. On December 21st, American forces went on the offensive. The 740th Tank Battalion, reinforced with additional Shermans and M36 tank destroyers, attacked toward L'Aglaise, supported by infantry and artillery. The objective was to drive Peiper's forces out of the town and eliminate his capability to threaten the Allied rear areas. The attack began with a massive artillery barrage. American gunners, using ammunition expenditure rates that would have been unthinkable for German forces with their chronic shortages, dropped thousands of shells on L'Aglaise. The bombardment destroyed buildings, cratered roads, and forced German defenders into cellars and basements. When the artillery lifted, American tanks and infantry advanced. The fighting became brutal urban combat where tanks engaged at ranges often under 50 yards. German infantry with Panzerfausts, the shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets that Germany was producing in vast quantities by late 1944, scored kills on several American tanks, but American artillery and tank fire systematically reduced German defensive positions. A Tiger positioned near L'Aglaise's church served as a strong point for German defenders. Its 88mm gun commanded the main approach road, and several American tanks had already been destroyed attempting to close with it. The Tiger's commander had positioned his vehicle in a hull-down position, using a slight rise to expose only the heavily armoured turret while the more vulnerable hull remained protected by terrain. This was textbook defensive employment of heavy armour. The Tiger could engage targets across its entire field of fire while presenting the smallest possible target. Its thick turret armour could defeat hits from American 75mm guns at virtually any angle. In normal circumstances, American forces would have called artillery fire to neutralize the position or waited for tank destroyers with 90mm guns to engage from long range. But Lieutenant Colonel Rubel chose a different approach. He positioned his assault gun platoon, 6 Shermans mounting 105mm howitzers designed for indirect fire support, in front of a chateau east of L'Aglaise. Then he personally climbed atop the chateau's wall, exposed to German fire, and directed the assault gun's fire onto the Tiger's position. The 105mm high-explosive shells couldn't penetrate the Tiger's armour, but they didn't need to. The massive concussive impacts damaged the Tiger's optics, jammed its turret traverse, and killed or wounded German infantry supporting the tank. When the Tiger attempted to withdraw for repairs, an M36 tank destroyer hit it in the side armour, where even the Tiger's protection was inadequate against 90mm armour-piercing rounds. The Tiger caught fire. Its crew bailed out and fled toward German lines. American infantry moved forward and secured the position. The psychological impact on remaining German defenders was significant. If even Tigers could be destroyed, what hope did lighter German armour have? What hope did infantry without armour support have against American combined arms assaults? By December 23rd, Kampfgruppe Peiper's situation had become untenable. Out of fuel, surrounded, and suffering mounting casualties, Peiper requested permission to break out on foot, abandoning his vehicles. German High Command initially refused, ordering him to hold position for relief that would never come. On Christmas Eve, with ammunition running low and American pressure increasing, Peiper finally received authorization to withdraw. Under cover of darkness, approximately 800 German survivors abandoned their vehicles and infiltrated back through American lines on foot. They left behind dozens of Panthers, Tigers, Mark IVs, half-tracks, and support vehicles. Some German tankers attempted to sabotage their vehicles before abandoning them, placing demolition charges or grenades in ammunition storage. Others simply walked away, too exhausted to complete the destruction thoroughly. American forces advancing into La Glaise on December 25th discovered a graveyard of German armour. Tiger tanks sat immobilized, their fuel tanks empty. Panthers blocked streets where they'd run out of gasoline during the withdrawal attempt. Half-tracks and trucks lined the roads, abandoned intact because the Germans lacked fuel to move them. The mechanical state of the abandoned vehicles revealed truths about German armour that propaganda had concealed. Many Panthers showed evidence of mechanical failure unrelated to combat damage. Final drives were cracked or broken. Transmissions had seized. Engines had overheated and warped cylinder heads. The mechanical reliability problems that had plagued German armour since Kursk in 1943 remained unsolved. American ordnance teams examined the captured vehicles with great interest. The technical sophistication was undeniable. German engineering had produced tanks with capabilities that exceeded Allied designs in armour protection and firepower. But that sophistication came at costs that German industry couldn't sustain. Complex manufacturing requiring skilled labour and precision parts, maintenance demands that frontline repair units couldn't meet, and fuel consumption that German logistics couldn't support. The 740th Tank Battalion's achievement at Stoumont and La Glaise would be recognized with a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest unit honors the American military could bestow. Captain Berry, Lieutenant Powers, and Staff Sergeant Lupi each received Silver Stars for their actions. But the greatest recognition came from the results. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most dangerous German penetration of the Battle of the Bulge, had been stopped and destroyed. The battalion's final tally for the Battle of the Bulge was to the battle: 69 enemy tanks destroyed, including 17 Tigers and Tiger IIs. These numbers represented verified kills that could be confirmed through examination of destroyed vehicles or multiple witness accounts. The actual number was probably higher, because tanks destroyed in areas American forces didn't immediately control couldn't be verified, and tanks damaged so severely they were abandoned and scrapped by Germans weren't counted as combat kills. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The 740th had demonstrated that American tanks and crews could defeat German armour when employed with tactics suited to the circumstances. Close-range ambushes in restrictive terrain neutralized German advantages in armour and firepower. Coordinated combined arms operations, with tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers all supporting each other, overcame German tactical skill. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical victory. American tankers had entered the Battle of the Bulge with deep-seated fears about German armour superiority. Those fears were based on real technical disparities. German tanks were genuinely more powerful, but the Stoumont action proved that technical superiority wasn't decisive when German tanks could be forced into situations where that superiority couldn't be employed effectively. Throughout January 1945, as American forces ground down the Bulge and drove German forces back to their starting positions, the tactical lessons from Stoumont were applied repeatedly. American tank crews learned to use terrain to force close-range engagements. They learned to coordinate with infantry to prevent German flanking movements. They learned that aggressive action often proved safer than cautious defense, because aggressive action kept German forces reacting instead of executing their own plans. The broader Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945. German forces had been pushed back to the Siegfried Line, having failed to achieve any of Hitler's objectives. The offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and 700 tanks. More critically, it had exhausted Germany's strategic reserves of men and armour that might have delayed the Soviet advance into Germany or the American and British advance across the Rhine. For the United States, the Bulge cost approximately 89,000 casualties out of 610,000 troops engaged. It was the bloodiest battle American forces fought in World War II, exceeding even the Normandy campaign in total losses. But the outcome had never been in serious doubt after the first week. American industrial capacity meant that tank losses could be replaced within weeks. Casualties could be replaced with trained replacements from the massive pool America had created. Germany had no such reserves. Every Panther destroyed at Stoumont was gone, forever. Every Tiger abandoned at La Glaise represented months of skilled labour and scarce materials that German industry couldn't replace. The 740th Tank Battalion would receive new tanks within days to replace combat losses. Kampfgruppe Peiper would never be reconstituted to its pre-bulge strength. The contrast between American and German logistics became even more stark during the final months of the war. The 740th continued fighting across Germany, participating in the Ruhr Pocket operation and advancing to the Elbe River. They fought at the Siegfried Line near Udenbrecht, on the Cologne Plain, and in multiple river crossing operations. The battalion maintained operational availability rates that German panzer units could only dream of achieving. At one point in April 1945, elements of the 740th overran a German airfield near Hagenau. German aircraft were attempting to take off as American tanks rolled across the runway. The tankers engaged the aircraft with their main guns and machine guns, destroying approximately 200 planes, most of them caught on the ground. The spectacle of tanks shooting down aircraft highlighted the desperation of Germany's situation. Luftwaffe units were so short of fuel, they'd gathered planes at forward airfields without adequate ground defences. The technical evolution of American armour continued throughout the final months of the war. The M26 Pershing heavy tank began reaching frontline units in February 1945. Mounting a 90mm gun and armour comparable to German Panthers, the Pershing finally gave American forces a tank that could engage Panthers and Tigers on equal terms at long range. But the Pershing arrived too late to fundamentally change American armour doctrine. By early 1945, American tankers had learned to defeat German armour using Shermans and tactics. The Pershing was welcomed for its capabilities, but it wasn't desperately needed the way it would have been in 1943. The war was being won with the equipment already in service, employed effectively through hard-won tactical lessons. The Sherman tank, much criticised for its thin armour and inadequate gun, proved to be exactly what American forces needed. It was reliable enough to sustain operations across thousands of miles. It was maintainable enough that field maintenance units could keep it operational. It was producible in quantities that ensured continuous replacement of combat losses, and when employed with proper tactics in suitable terrain, it could defeat any German tank in service. The fundamental principle underlying American success in armoured warfare wasn't technical superiority, it was systematic sustainability. American armour succeeded because American industry could build tanks faster than combat destroyed them, because American training programs could produce crews faster than casualties depleted them, and because American logistics could deliver fuel, ammunition, and parts faster than operations consumed them. Germany had built better individual tanks. The Panther was probably the best medium tank design of World War II on a purely technical basis. The Tiger, despite its mechanical issues, was a formidable weapon that dominated battlefields where it could be properly employed and maintained. But German industry couldn't build enough of them. German training programs couldn't provide enough qualified crews, and German logistics couldn't sustain their operations. The Battle of Stoumont demonstrated these principles in microcosm. German technical superiority in armour and firepower meant nothing when German tanks were manoeuvred into positions where they couldn't employ those advantages. American willingness to take casualties to deliberately expose tanks to German fire in order to close to effective range proved decisive. American artillery support, vastly exceeding anything German forces could match due to ammunition supply advantages, shaped the battlefield before tank engagements even began. The human dimension of this equation deserves emphasis. American tank crews who let Panthers close to 50 yards before engaging were not superhuman. They were ordinary young men, most barely out of their teens, who were terrified of German armour and desperately wanted to survive the war. What they possessed was training, leadership, and a system that supported their efforts. The training the 740th received at Fort Knox and Camp Baus had emphasized marksmanship and fire discipline. Crews practiced target identification until they could distinguish Panthers from Mark IVs at a glance. Gunners practiced engagement sequences until laying the gun on target and firing became instinctive. Commanders practiced tactical decision-making through endless map exercises and field problems. Leadership from officers like Lieutenant Colonel Rubel, Captain Berry, and Lieutenant Powers provided the confidence that made aggressive tactics possible. When junior officers saw their commanders exposing themselves to enemy fire, standing in open turret hatches to direct operations, it was impossible to justify shirking comparable risks. Leadership by example, a principle as old as warfare itself, proved as important in mechanized combat as it had been in ancient battles. The system that supported these men included immediate tactical air support once weather cleared, though at Stoumont the fog had prevented this. It included artillery that responded to fire missions within minutes. It included engineer support to clear obstacles and demolish bridges. It included medical evacuation that saved wounded tankers who would have died in previous wars. It included a replacement system that sent new tanks and crews forward continuously. Germany possessed none of these systematic advantages. German tactical air support had evaporated under Allied air superiority. German artillery was chronically short of ammunition. German engineers lacked equipment for large-scale obstacle construction. German medical services were overwhelmed. German replacement systems were exhausted. Individual German soldiers and tankers fought with skill and courage, but they fought within a system that was collapsing around them. The 740th Tank Battalion's combat record extended beyond the Bulge. The battalion participated in nearly every major operation in northwest Europe from December 1944 through May 1945. They fought in the Rhineland campaign, crossed the Rhine River on a pontoon bridge at Bonn, participated in reducing the Ruhr pocket, and reached the Elbe River just days before Germany's surrender. Throughout these operations, the battalion maintained the aggressive tactical approach developed at Stoumont. They led with reconnaissance, used terrain to force close engagements, coordinated closely with infantry and artillery, and accepted risks when calculated risks offered advantages. The operational tempo they sustained would have been impossible for German panzer units with their chronic maintenance and supply problems. Private Harry Miller, the loader who'd helped assemble tanks at Stoumont, participated in most of these operations. He recalled the Rhine crossing as particularly memorable. It was pretty much like riding a roller coaster. You'd see the vehicles ahead of you going down and hope they're going to go back up. The pontoon bridge flexed under the weight of 60-ton tanks, rising and falling with each vehicle that crossed. But the bridge held, and American armor poured across the Rhine into Germany's industrial heartland. The battalion was still advancing when Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. They'd been in combat for less than 6 months, but in that time they'd travelled from Belgium through Germany, engaged in dozens of actions, destroyed, verified enemy tanks numbering in the dozens with total enemy vehicles destroyed or captured running into hundreds. 13 men from the battalion gave their lives. Compared to casualties suffered by many infantry battalions, this was relatively light, reflecting both the protection armoured vehicles provided and the effectiveness of American combined arms tactics that prevented tanks from being isolated and destroyed. The final accounting of the 740th Service revealed statistics that captured the nature of American armoured warfare. The battalion lost tanks to combat and mechanical failure, but replacements arrived so quickly that operational strength rarely fell below authorized levels. Crews rotated between line service and rear areas for rest, a luxury German tankers never enjoyed. Maintenance was performed on predictable schedules with adequate spare parts, preventing the catastrophic mechanical failures that plagued German armour. These mundane logistics and administrative factors determined victory more surely than any individual battle. Wars are won not by single engagements, however dramatic, but by systematic application of force over extended periods. The side that can sustain operations while denying the enemy equivalent capability will eventually prevail, regardless of tactical victories or defeats along the way. The lessons the 740th learned about defeating German armor through close-range tactics in restrictive terrain became part of American armor doctrine. Training programs incorporated Stoumont as a case study in how terrain and tactics could overcome enemy technical superiority. Tank manuals emphasized the importance of coordinating with infantry and artillery rather than attempting independent tank versus tank combat. Leadership courses stressed the need for aggressive action and calculated risk-taking when circumstances warranted. These institutional lessons, encoded in doctrine and training, shaped American armor employment for the remainder of the 20th century. The principle that adequate equipment deployed effectively defeats superior equipment deployed poorly became foundational to American military thinking. The corollary principle, that sustaining operations over time matters more than winning individual engagements, guided force structure and procurement decisions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.